Welcome to the Boom Clap podcast, where culture and conviction collide. I'm Rita Rogers.
And I'm Cecily Dickey.
All right, today we are talking psychedelics. Not a place I'd ever thought we'd go on this podcast, but it came up through conversation around election time and RFK and the MAHA movement. And it turns out people have a lot of strong feelings about psychedelics. And there's a huge movement in America right now, Canada, all over, I guess, really. Ashley tells us in the episode that more people currently right now are on psychedelics than there were in the 60s. She recently wrote a book, The Thing That Would Make Everything Okay Forever, Transcendence, Psychedelics, and Jesus Christ. It's an excellent book. It just traverses her experience using psychedelics and then coming to Jesus. Very well written book. And we talked to her today about her story in general, but also why people should be paying attention to this and why people should be talking about it and not just taking the use of psychedelics so lightly. And even at the end, she says, I think Christians will be forced eventually within the coming years to develop some kind of conversation around this and address it head on. And this is something we talk about all the time on the podcast, is that we're constantly behind on the conversations. And so if you think it's weird to be talking about psychedelics now, it's not going to be weird in a few years. It's just we're ahead of the ball game on this. We're ahead of the curve. I guess that's what I should say. We're ahead of the curve. And it's something that you should be aware of.
Yeah. What I find really interesting is how there's more people using it now than in the 60s. But I think what is very unique about it, or I guess interesting and telling, is that in the 60s, it was the hippies. That's it. It was one group of people that were using psychedelics, right? But now it's people like entrepreneurs, business people, influencers, people who have really successful looking, interesting looking lives, the people that you'd follow on social media, people into self-improvement and all of these things. So the thing is, when someone you trust and someone you follow says something has helped them reach a new level, it's hard to think critically about it because you want to believe what this person has said. And maybe what they're saying is true from their perspective, but it's actually not true in reality and like at the root of things. So I guess why we recommend her book and why we recommend this podcast episode is because we really want to equip people to think critically about this issue before it starts coming, because it is coming.
It's mainstream already, I think.
Yeah. And it's going to be talked about in government and regulations.
Yeah.
And it's important to know what you think so that you can have a voice about it. And the words that just come to my mind is be sober-minded. Right? You cannot consume a psychedelic drug and at the same time be sober-minded, which is what we are called to. So anyway, be sober-minded as you listen, be sober-minded as you read the book. And I really hope and pray that this helps. If it's been a foggy issue for you, I really hope this clarifies things a bit.
Yeah. And for people who may be listening and don't know exactly what we're talking about when we mean psychedelics, I'm just going to outline a few names that you might have heard within the mainstream, because this is being talked about on Joe Rogan. The Shawn Ryan podcast has addressed it a lot in reference to veterans, other mainstream health podcasts. Like, it's been heavily discussed, but sometimes people don't even know what we're talking about because they're not saying psychedelics necessarily. They're talking about ayahuasca, psilocybin, ibogaine, peyote has been discussed, LSD, MDMA, which is also known as ecstasy. These are some different terms you might hear that all mean psychedelics. Are different, but they all mean psychedelics. I even heard, I was listening to a clip with Aaron Rodgers who was talking about, it's just so flippant how people are talking about it now. I was listening to a clip, he was talking about, he was on the, Pete McAfee. His first name's not Pete. It's escaping me, but he's on that ESPN show all the time. And he was talking about people getting the COVID vaccine and how he was kind of making fun because he had been kicked off about his comments on COVID vaccine. And he was saying people need to list that in their bios, just like I list ayahuasca and how I'm into ayahuasca. And he just said it just like that and went on. And it's just this thing now people don't even really put much thought to. So I'm excited for you guys to listen to Ashley and hear what she has to say and really contemplate her experience with it. Before we get into it, please do leave us a review if you haven't yet. Wherever you listen, you can leave a 5-star, you can leave a written review on Apple. Go listen to our previous episodes. Last week, we had Joel Gator on. We talked about pediatrics and finding a good pediatrician that can align with your values, I guess, and your values of how you take care of your child. We're in the heart of winter, and everyone's looking for different ways to support their immune system. RoweCasaOrganics.com has many items that fit the bill, and you can use the code BOOMCLAP to save 20% on your order. One of the first items on your list when you go to RoweCasaOrganics.com should be their elderberry syrup. They have over 1,000 5-star reviews, and in one weekend last year, they sold over 7,000 bottles. There's a reason it's a hot-selling item. It works. They have many other items for your immune system needs. Go to RoweCasaOrganics.com and use the code BOOMCLAP to save 20% on your first order. All right. Hi, Ashley. We are thrilled to have you on today with us. I really want to set the stage for this episode, but I'm going to do that in a little bit. First, I want you to just give a little bit of information about who you are and the book you wrote, your story a little bit. We'll get into your story deeper, but just like kind of a version that people like, this is what we're talking about today.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me on, by the way. My name is Ashley Lande. I'm a writer and an artist. We currently live in rural Kansas. I have 3 children and a 4th on the way. And the book I wrote is called The Thing That Would Make Everything Okay Forever, Transcendence, Psychedelics, and Jesus Christ. And it is essentially a memoir chronicling my journey from being heavily involved in psychedelic use to psychedelic use was essentially my religion, along with different yoga and New Age practices. And that went on for most of my 20s. And I found Jesus Christ toward the end of that period. And yeah, it's my story. So.
Yeah. So I just got done reading your book. You are a great writer.
Thank you.
Sometimes I pick up new books and they all follow the same rhythm and it's kind of boring, and yours does not do that. And so I messaged Cecily just when I started reading even the first page. I was like, she writes differently. Like, you would appreciate this writing. And so anyway, just very good on the surface level, despite the content, but the content was good as well. And I told Cecily, this isn't exactly where I wanted to start, but I told Cecily just a bit ago that even just separating psychedelics and then the New Age practices, just going into the New Age portion was interesting in and of itself, because when you look at culture and what's happening in the wellness community, there's a lot of people and Christians getting involved in New Age unwittingly, right, without even adding the psychedelic portion to it. So I thought that there was a lot of value there for everyone, despite even potentially being involved in psychedelics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's absolutely true. I've had friends who've kind of unwittingly, and I think because I have such an awareness of it, because I was immersed in it for so long, I can be like, ooh, I really don't think that's a good road you're going down. I don't think that's and unfortunately I have friends who have readily recognized it, but it's very, and a lot of the New Age beliefs that are kind of packaged as wellness things or wellness are very seductive, because you think like, oh, this is just something that can enhance my health, enhance my well-being, but is actually potentially dangerous practice. But yeah, when it's cloaked in that language and cloaked in that self-improvement language, it can be very, very seductive.
Yeah, for sure. So the reason we stumbled on the psychedelic topic is the Maha movement. Okay. So RFK Jr. put out this post like right before the election, and it said something, well, I'm just going to read here. The FDA's war on public health is about to end. This includes aggressive suppression of psychedelics, peptides, stem cells, raw milk, hyperbaric therapies, and he lists a number of things. But I was like, psychedelics is first in line. And that really struck me. And then I was going back to, like I said, some of the wellness community that I'm involved in, like just in watching and seeing what's going on. I've seen these therapists and practitioners start using MDMA. And so immediately, like next up in my stories, I had put like, I realize MDMA and ecstasy is kind of trendy, but we can have reservations about these things. We don't need to jump on board. Like we need to think about this. And I got a slew of messages, like everything from like, oh, I didn't even know this was a thing, to like, you need to watch it. Like, don't be so judgmental. Yeah. But most people were like, I don't think he's talking about MDMA. I don't think he's talking about any of those things. He's talking about microdosing mushrooms, and that's it. Well, then I had found him actually speaking, and his son had went on an ayahuasca trip, like a full on ceremony, and supposedly completely cured his mental issues and came out and emerged a completely new person. And so I ended up putting together just kind of some of the history of the CIA using LSD for experiments on mind control. And this is a very aware group of people who are have reservations about the government. So it's interesting to me that so many people are falling into this, like, oh, it's fine, like putting these things in my body that control my mind. So anyway, this is setting the stage for why I really think this conversation is culturally pertinent at this moment, because I see these things on the rise and people just picking them up because some of them are promoted as natural.
Right. Yeah. And I was startled too when I saw that tweet that RFK made and that psychedelics was the first on the list. I said to my husband, wow, like, and all the other things were, as I remember, you know, most, if not all of the other things were reasonable health measures, you know, that I would approve of, and that seemed very reasonable. But that was the first on the list. And I thought, wow. And I know Elon Musk is very into psychedelics before. He's touted psychedelics, and I don't know what kind of role he's going to play. I don't know if there's like an official role that he has yet in the Trump administration, but of course, I've never heard Trump say anything about them, you know. So my mom, when I've mentioned it to my mom, she's like, oh, that's just talk. And I said, Mom, it really, though, there are powerful people in like Silicon Valley. There are very powerful people who are touting these things. And like you said, it's like a very pertinent topic, and it's fascinating. I feel like God kind of, I don't know. I don't want to say like dragged me kicking and screaming into writing about it. But right after the last time I ever took psychedelics, I was probably, I don't know, 29, 30. And for several years after that, and then I was completely done. Like I wrote about in the book, I was just done. I was done with all of it. And pretty soon thereafter, I fully surrendered myself to the gospel and accepted Jesus Christ. And for several years after that, I really didn't want to talk about psychedelics. I didn't want anything to do with psychedelics, like the trappings of, I just, you know, I didn't even like burning incense anymore. Just anything that to me was associated with, I didn't practice yoga anymore. Anything to me that was associated with it, I couldn't handle. And then when I noticed it was kind of, probably 5 years ago, I noticed it was coming into vogue again. And what kind of spurred me to start thinking about writing about it was there's an article in the Atlantic that I became aware of actually by way of Ecstasis magazine, which I later wrote for on the topic of psychedelics. And this article in the Atlantic was by a journalist talking about how MDMA specifically, and acid to a lesser extent, had helped her to completely abandon her evangelical upbringing and completely be free of it. And I thought, you know, gosh, that's interesting and sad to me. And I thought maybe there's somebody that should be writing about this from the opposite direction. Because I know at least in the 60s, there were plenty of people. And I thought, well, that's my story, but I don't, I don't necessarily want to write about it. But then slowly, I think I did write maybe an article for Fathom magazine, a Christian magazine. And then I did not plan on writing a book about it at all, but I was contacted by the editor of the publishing house that I ended up signing a contract with. And he encouraged me to submit a proposal, and the rest is history. So I feel like it wasn't a lot of my own initiative, like I feel like God was kind of pushing me into it, because I really think that, well, the present moment too, but also in the years to come, like the harvest will be very ripe, because there will be so many people for whom the outsized, and they are completely outsized and exaggerated promises of psychedelics are not going to deliver. And it really scares me too. There's, you may have heard at Johns Hopkins University, they're kind of, at least in the United States, they're one of the leading institutions that has a psychedelic therapy department. And one of the doctors who was kind of, I don't know if he's with the project anymore, but he was second in charge under Roland Griffiths, who the whole field is so problematic, because psychedelics do tend to, for the people who don't have a horrible experience right off the bat, which I've met those people and I know those people, psychedelics tend to breed very enthusiastic devotees. And so even the psychedelic therapy field that is operating under the guise of neutral science, it really isn't. Like, if I've listened to podcasts with some of the people, like, it's particularly Roland Griffiths, who was the head, he's since passed away, but he was the head of the research at Johns Hopkins, very, very into Eastern religion, Eastern mysticism, like very ideologically driven, that psychedelics were going to somehow open up people's consciousness, that they were going to engender this new, like, almost utopia, which all those ideas are, I mean, that's how I felt when I first started doing psychedelics. All those ideas were popular in the 60s. And so it's really interesting to note that these people are not, even the people who are doing it under the guise of scientists, are not neutral. But I brought that up because there was the doctor underneath him. Like I said, I'm not sure he's with the project anymore, Matthew Johnson. I listened to him on a podcast several years ago, and he talked about how he enjoys going to Burning Man. And, so he too was ideologically driven. He was immersed in the culture. And he just said flat out, with the so-called psychedelic renaissance occurring and more people taking psychedelics again, which I've read statistically now, I guess the National Institutes for Drug, or maybe National Institute of Health, their drug survey, like there are more people using psychedelics now than there were in the 60s.
Wow. That's impressive.
Yeah. And, but this Dr. Matthew Johnson said, like, there are going to be casualties. Like, he said that on a podcast. He said there will be casualties. And that just, it breaks my heart and it scares me. And it's really fascinating too to note, when I was preparing to go on Unbelievable with Justin Brierley to talk about psychedelics, and ended up debating, it ended up being more of a debate than I thought it would with his other guests. And through various avenues, I contacted a lot of probably like 10 to 15 people from the 60s who were super into hippie culture then and super into psychedelics then, who became Christian. And they had just the most fascinating stories, and they were so helpful. But I found it a really common thread. I think almost every single one of them knew at least one person who had not psychologically returned from using psychedelics. Wow. And I that was so sad. And I think after maybe that podcast or a subsequent one, there was a young man who contacted me via Instagram, and he said it was reassuring. He said he had taken psychedelics. I can't remember which psychedelic it was, probably acid, for the first time a year prior. And he still, like, every single day was just huge psychological struggle for him. And it was reassuring to see, he said, to see me talking on this podcast and appearing to be reasonably psychologically intact and okay after how many drugs I'd taken. Yeah. And that really broke my heart too. And I try to pray for him when I remember it. But it's scary. I think, and sorry, I don't want to just ramble on and on. There's so much I could say about this, but Yeah, the health claims, the spiritual claims, the psychological claims are so overblown. And the reality is, like you said, the CIA gave up on using LSD for Mike because it didn't work, because it was so unpredictable. And so for these people to act like it's this panacea that can reliably do all these things, cure mental illness, it's just wrong. It's a lie. And so I do think, in the years to come, the harvest will be ripe. Like, one of my friends will talk about psychedelic refugees, like there will be psychedelic and you can see even now the kind of I don't know what you call it, like things shifting a bit with someone like Joe Rogan, who's in the past has been, and I don't know that he's abandoned psychedelics, probably not, but has been super enthusiastic about how much he loves psychedelics and how amazing they are and how great they are. And now all of a sudden he's exploring Christianity. So I would think at the very least that would suggest that he finds something lacking in the worldview that psychedelics have been a significant part of for him. I haven't gotten a chance to, I can't wait to, I've tried, having a toddler makes it hard to listen to things sometimes, but I've tried to listen in some installments to his interview with Wesley Huff. And I've heard that it's great. So I'm looking forward to listening to that.
It's interesting you bring up Joe Rogan. I had actually messaged Cecily the other day. I was like, Russell Brand became a Christian last year. Maybe this is Joe Rogan's year. And then with Wesley Huff coming on, that would really be, I don't know, that would be amazing.
It would be.
He did, like, I actually have a clip, and I was just going to play it in the intro. Maybe I should play it now, but a clip from him talking about psychedelics just prior to the election. He had JD Vance on and was talking about psychedelics. So I'll actually just play that now.
Sure.
I'm excited that Bobby Kennedy is interested in this as well, is psychedelic therapy for veterans. I think if there's a way to understand the benefits of psychedelic therapy for everybody, the real pathway is through veterans who I think are the most needing of it, the most deserving of it, the most neglected in terms of the horrors that they experience, and having to carry this around their mind. And that there's a way that many people have experienced relief and it's not available to them. And it's not something that's dangerous. It's not something that's addictive. You literally can't even eat enough psilocybin to kill yourself. It's not even, you can't do it. You wouldn't be able to consume it.
So there's a lot that's interesting there. But the one thing that I think is maybe people won't pick up on is he said, if there's a way to understand psychedelics for everyone, veterans are the way. And this is like with a lot of things, people want to introduce things for the major population. They will find someone in need of something to be able to get a foothold. And so I just don't want people to skip over that part, that he's saying like psychedelics can have something to offer for everyone, but veterans are the way to introduce it. So, but anyway, I really would like you to address the ending part where he's like, it's not addictive. Like you're not going to ever ingest enough to harm yourself, those kind of things.
Yeah. And that episode I didn't get a chance to listen to either when he had Vance or Trump, and I wanted to, but I just have not gotten around to it. And now it kind of seems like the urgent moment has passed, but I didn't know that they addressed psychedelics. I kind of want to go back and listen to that. But I guess it's true that it would be hard. Psilocybin isn't toxic in the same way that some other mushrooms are toxic. Like if you eat a destroying angel mushroom, I forget what the scientific name is, like you're going to die within 48 hours. But so it's not physically toxic to that degree. But I mean, you could ingest enough psilocybin to, I'd say, run a pretty high risk of psychologically damaging yourself, not physiologically, like not the physical damage to your brain, but psychologically. I mean, I think that's a pretty irresponsible thing for him to say, but I mean, he's Joe Rogan. I know but that's really fascinating. And the aspect of, this is true of so many different things, but news headlines, they'll take a scientific study and they want a sensational headline that sounds hyperbolic, and so you can't just read the headlines. You have to go and read the scientific studies, which I haven't done a ton of, admittedly, but sometimes you go, these headlines that revolutionary new drug can save veterans, and then you go and read the study and it's like, well, actually the results aren't nearly that conclusive. And that's true for so many of the studies revolving around psychedelics. And a lot of times it's interesting, the follow-up periods in some of the studies that I've read that say, in the news headlines will say like, oh, new miracle psychedelic can cure depression. And it's like, well, the follow-up period was only 3 weeks to a month. I wouldn't say someone's necessarily cured. When you say cured of depression, that implies lifelong, never experiences it again. It's like, well, if the follow-up period is only less than a month, that's not really a cure. Like, how can they make those claims? So I'm very skeptical about the therapeutic potential, just because I feel like I don't know that the potential benefits outweigh the dangers of the potential damage, and also the potential that some people are really damaged by the experience itself. Like, there have been trials out of Johns Hopkins where people and elsewhere, there were people felt really damaged by the experience itself and had a horrible trip, horrible reaction, and then were kind of minimized in the study and the news releases because it ruins the narrative. It ruins the agenda, to admit that these people, it did the opposite for them. It didn't cure anything. In fact, it might have engendered new psychiatric diagnoses. So it's hard to refute someone's subjective claim that they feel better after they took something. And I struggle with that a little bit. But on the whole, like, if someone personally approached me and said, hey, do you think I should try microdosing psilocybin, which the whole microdosing thing, I don't even really see how that makes sense, because when I was into psychedelics, microdosing would have been like half of a dose or a quarter of a dose. And now people are talking about like a 20th of a dose. And I don't see how that would be anything other than really a placebo, because the supposed benefits of it are the psychological effects that it engenders. And it's not going to engender any kind of psychological effect at that tiny of a dose. So
very interesting.
I don't think that's, I think that's kind of propaganda. But like, if someone personally approached me, I would always say no. I would always say, no, I don't think that's a good idea. No, I don't think you should do that. So it makes me very, of course, I'm not in a position where I'm to make decisions about that. I just hope that the president and vice president will not be overly influenced by those people and will proceed with great caution. But it does make me nervous.
Yeah. So I would love to hear a little bit about why you first started taking psychedelics, and what that looked like for you over the period of time that you were doing it. Like, what kept you going using them, and what brought you to just getting to that point where you're like, I'm done with this. I want to hear that story. And I think it'd be really interesting for people to then hear like what brought you out of it eventually.
Sure. Yeah. I kind of just not accidentally, but I just kind of fell into it. Whereas someone like my husband, he was really a huge Beatles fan when he was 12, 13 years old. That was really one of the first bands that he got into on his own. And he said he always wanted to take acid because the Beatles took acid. And so that was, a years long anticipation that he had of taking psychedelics. And whereas for me, I was just became very reckless as a teenager and into my late teens. And in college, I did a lot of partying and binge drinking, and eventually tired of that, wearied of that because it was so destructive. Obviously, I hated having hangovers. I hated being embarrassed by things I had said and done the night previous. It was just, even then in my secular mind, my non-Christian mind, I could recognize this is something that's destructive. And so by my senior year of high school, I had slowed way down on that. I thought I could control my drinking. And I had a friend who said that he had some psilocybin mushrooms. And I really didn't know anything about psychedelics other than that they were associated with hippies in the 60s. And I had no hesitation whatsoever because I had no preconceptions about what it would be like, or I had no preconceptions of it being potentially dangerous. And so I said, sure, why not? And I took them with a couple of other friends that night, and we just had a good time. I thought it was enchanting. I thought it was beautiful and interesting. The visual distortions and hallucinations and auditory distortions and hallucinations, listening to music. And I didn't have, that night, there wasn't anything to give me pause about doing it again. I didn't have any scary, there was no part of it that was scary. It was just really interesting. And I did feel kind of different, I guess. I felt more, I don't know, more open, or I felt like I had broken out of my rut somehow. And so after that, and I didn't have a hangover the next morning, which I was really intrigued by. I felt perfectly fine. And so I was totally open to doing it again over the course of the next year. I think there were maybe 2 or 3 more times that I took psilocybin mushrooms. And then there was a time, like I said, about a year after that, that I couldn't find any psilocybin mushrooms. Nobody I knew had any. And except there was this one guy that I had met, and he said, well, I don't have any mushrooms, but I have LSD. And I said, okay, like same thing, right? And so like I said, I kind of went into that with the same recklessness with which I had gone into the psilocybin use. And that was a really, I've called it a really shattering experience. Like it was a really destabilizing experience. It was, I remember immediately afterward, I couldn't decide if it was good or bad. Like I didn't know. I was like, was the thing that just happened to me good or bad? I knew it was something that had really, like I said, really destabilized me, really changed me. It felt very cataclysmic. It felt like everything I had ever known had been completely subverted, turned upside down, and that I really wasn't sure what was true anymore. But I had never experienced anything like that before. And I think just by virtue of the total novelty of it, I was intrigued. And I remember saying, I don't know if I'll ever do that again. Like maybe I'll do that like once a year. And then it was only within a couple weeks that I was doing it again. And from there on, I just, I say in the book, like I've used the words fell in love with it, because I did in a way, but that love was eventually almost became Stockholm syndrome, because to me, the psychedelics were the path to what I would call God at that time, and they were the path to transcendence. But I had some really horrifying trips, which anybody who goes for long enough using psychedelics will eventually have a bad trip. And my dog yawning. And I was so beholden to psychedelics as the way to transcendence, as my religion, as as my way to quote unquote God. Although increasingly as I went along, I could not have defined, I could never have defined who that God was, whether it was a benevolent God. I didn't really know. I just knew, I just knew there was transcendence. I knew there was something outside of my normal consciousness that I had experienced, and things got pretty dark and pretty hairy at actually several times. You would think after the first time that things got really dark for me with psychedelics, I would have quit, and that's not what happened. There were series of valleys over the years before I finally was willing to look at them and be like, these are not what I thought they were. These substances are not what I thought they were, and they're in fact leading to destruction. So, yeah.
One thing you said in your book about taking psychedelics versus other drug users, I remember you brought up Slash from Guns N' Roses, and you're like, I'm not that type of drug user. This is spiritual. This is a spiritual experience. And you brought that up many times about how you saw yourself as a different type of drug user and what you were seeking from it. And that really just piqued my interest, because I don't know anything about psychedelics really, other than what I've, read about, like we talked about earlier. And everything I kept reading and getting messages from people, just, it seemed like this protected thing, just like you were describing. And that I just don't think you can separate it from a spiritual nature. And that's the part I feel like is so dangerous. And like you said, you're not in a position to make decisions really governmentally or for other people. And I don't want to be, but all I want from this conversation is not for people to hear like, don't take psychedelics, don't whatever. Like, what I want people to hear is like, you need to exercise caution, and you need to see that there is something more to this than just like a drug.
Right. Yeah. And I think I've been in that situation too, where, and I myself was once that way. I would have been extremely defensive about, if someone tried to I was extremely defensive when people tried to tell me. I remember and I wouldn't have even called them drugs. Like, I would have called them medicine, sacraments. I would not have called them drugs, because to me, they weren't even in the same category. They were set apart. They were special. And I remember I had a boyfriend at the time before I met my husband, when I was very into taking psychedelics, kind of my first wave of being super into psychedelics. And I was going on to him about, if everybody could just take psychedelics, like if everybody, which is a common sentiment in the 60s, if we could just get all the politicians to take psychedelics, it would cure all the ills. There'd be no more war. There'd be peace, universal peace, usher in this universal utopia. And interestingly, as an aside, the head of, formerly called MAPS, now it's called Lycos, which has been probably the biggest organization that has been instrumental in promoting MDMA for veterans. They were known as Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, and they've existed since the 80s, but they kind of zeroed in on MDMA because it seems to have a better chance of legalization for therapy. And I would say that's probably a strategy to kind of Trojan horse all the other psychedelics. But anyway, the head of that organization, Rick Doblin, he thinks that if we could just get like the head of Hamas and the Israeli president together and give them ayahuasca, like he said this publicly, then all the problems would be solved. And I'm like, it's almost, if I didn't know that there were some villainous things going on behind the scenes in that organization too, it almost like makes me sad, and how naive it is, I look back at myself and how naive I was about it. But anyway, my boyfriend at the time, I was rattling on about all this, and he said, but millions of people took psychedelics back in the 60s and nothing changed. And I was just kind of dumbstruck. Like, I didn't have a response. I was like, and a lot of people, it's interesting. I try not to read YouTube comments on podcasts I've done, and I've read some reviews of my book, but I try not to get too wrapped up in it, because I don't know. It's hard when you've written a memoir. It's hard not to take criticism personally, because it's your personal story. But I've gotten that energy of like, well, she just didn't know what she was doing. like she didn't do it right, basically, which is a common theme. And like, if you had done it right, then you wouldn't, you would have had good results. Like if you had, and that's just so interesting. But that was kind of my only answer for that back then. Like, well, I guess they didn't do it right, or they didn't do enough, or they didn't, so I'm trying, now I've gotten so off on a tangent. What was your original question?
No, just how there's always a spiritual undertone, really.
Yes, yes. Yeah. And I think there's absolutely always a spiritual undertone. And I feel like that inner defensive posture that a lot of people will have toward criticism of psychedelics, and like I said, that I once had, I think, at least for myself, I know I can say it was indicative of idolatry. Like psychedelics were my idol, and I had to defend my idol at all costs. I couldn't tolerate criticism of my idol. And so I just think, like I said, I know for me, at least, that that's very, very telling and very interesting. And like you say, there is always a spiritual energy behind it. There's really, and I don't think there are many scientists out there who are working in that field, or psychologists who are working in that field, for whom there is not a spiritual energy behind it. There was a study at, and you can even go back and look at, Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert at Harvard in the 60s. Like, they began as supposedly neutral investigators and quickly became completely spiritual, completely ideological, and they both got kicked out of Harvard, and they both became kind of self-styled gurus of the psychedelic movement. And you can see that happening again, like I said, in the psychedelic science movement today, with people like Roland Griffiths. Like, they create evangelists, basically. They create evangelists. And, I think a lot about too, in terms of the danger of using them therapeutically, and also that spiritual energy behind it. I think about Jesus talking about I think it's in 2 of the Gospels, and I think it's in Luke 7 or 11. I should remember this, where he talks about the man who had a demon went out of a man, and went around and could find no place to rest, went around in arid places, could find no place to rest. And in the end, came back to the man to find his house clean and swept, and brought back 7 other demons with him. And the man's condition was worse than before. I feel like psychedelics, and it's a huge if they did have any therapeutic potential, I guess it would be in that they do seem to have an ability sometimes, but like I said, there again, it's so unpredictable, it's so risky to break people out of a rut of thinking. But the problem is, when you clean house, what's there? If you don't have the Holy Spirit, if you don't have Christ, like what is there? And which is not to say that you're safe to do psychedelics if you do know Jesus, but I just think that aspect of it is very scary. But like I said, that's not even predictably necessarily a result. So, and it also can be so hugely destabilizing that someone who is already on tenuous psychological ground, that could be devastating. So, yeah, I'm just very skeptical. But like you said, anyway, a long way around to answer that question. Yes, there is always a spiritual energy behind it. It never seems like it's simple as just, I took them once and they were really helpful, and don't think I'll ever do that again. And it wasn't really spiritual, but it just made me feel less depressed. I just feel like that's not a story that I ever really hear.
Yeah. Well, the spiritual energy that is clearly linked with the psychedelics, you're talking about, how the room was swept clean and there was room for more demons to come in. It's almost like the psychedelics if they do that one therapeutic thing, it's almost like what they're doing is creating that space and the door has been left open for these things, right? And some of the language you used earlier, you were saying when you were in the midst of using psychedelics, you would have called them things like sacraments or set apart and special. And that's all extremely spiritual language, right? So it's all married. And then something else that I found really interesting was people would read your book or hear you on podcasts and say, well, she just didn't do it right. And it makes me think of communism and socialism, because that's a very common argument for that. It's like, well, socialism, communism, Marxism, it is the way. It's just never been done right before. And it's like, okay, well, how many millions of lives do we want to lose in this horrible experiment? It's alarming.
While I believe the doctor's office can have its time and place, I am so thankful for the ways that I have learned to take care of my family's health at home and for the tools that I have in my toolbox, as I call it, to help care for my family when they're sick. One of those tools that I've put in my family's toolbox is homeopathy. And one of the brands that we trust is Remedy Collective. We have their first aid kit, which has a guide with a list of problems that I can go to decide what remedy I want to use. And the first aid kit has a bunch of remedies that cover almost all of the problems that we will encounter. It's been so helpful for our family to have. If you're interested in learning more about homeopathy and possibly getting a first aid kit for you and your family, go to remedycollective.com/boomclappodcast and use the code boomclap to save 10% on your order.
So what I want you to talk about now, and if this is too soon to get into this, and if anyone has anything else to say before we get into it, just jump in. But I'm really curious, like you were describing this idol of psychedelics. What do you think is the difference between what the idol of psychedelics offered and what you found in Jesus? Like what makes you think like, psychedelics offered me this, but I turned away from it and chose this instead? Like what makes you say Jesus is better?
Yeah. That's a wonderful question. And sorry, I just wanted to comment real quick on one of my friends and I, he actually contacted me after I was on Unbelievable. And at the time he was at Harvard Divinity School and he was still thinking that he had returned to Christianity, the Christianity of his childhood, but he was still thinking there was a way that he could incorporate psychedelic practice into Christianity. And we started corresponding by email. And slowly he's come to disavow psychedelic use. And he's done a lot of research into the Johns Hopkins trials and the abuses there. And anyway, and so sometimes when one of the other sees like a news item or something interesting in the psychedelic world, we'll still message each other. But we say a lot like, oh, real psychedelic therapy has never been tried. Like the real communism has never been tried thing. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So yeah, absolutely. Gosh, I love this question. It's such a big question. I think what I was looking for in psychedelics, I think a lot about that C.S. Lewis quote about every man who, hammers on the door of a brothel, at least maybe initially at some point, is actually looking for God. And I think there's some truth in that. Like, I think since God has planted eternity in the human heart, I was looking for transcendence. I had, up until the point of that first LSD trip, I had said I was an atheist, but atheism was beginning to seem increasingly empty and hollow. And I just had this feeling like there must be something more. But there was also the sinful aspect of like, well, I don't want to submit to anything or anyone. But there was that yearning for more. There was that yearning for, and there was that feeling of the insufficiency of man-made philosophy, like the inadequacy of it and the emptiness of it. And so I think what I thought psychedelics were giving me, I thought psychedelics were taking me out of myself I thought they were supplying me an experience of transcendence and contact with something beyond myself, which, in regards to your, comment about doors, spiritual doors being opened, I think they were, but it's not. I think too a lot about what Jesus said in John 10 about anyone who does not enter by the gate is a thief and a liar. Mm-hmm. And I think psychedelics, there was an old former hippie who said something to me really early on when I was kind of starting to reflect on my past with psychedelics and starting to ask those questions of like, what was that? Like what really happened with that? And getting to the point where I didn't feel so, where God had healed me enough where I didn't feel so damaged by all of it that I just didn't even want to think about it, and starting to think about it. And he said that psychedelics take us places that we were never meant to go. Mm-hmm. And I think that is absolutely true. I think a lot about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the Garden of Eden. I just feel like there's some relationship there that psychedelics have to that. I feel like psychedelics give people access to, I don't know if I'd say like forbidden knowledge or knowledge that human beings aren't meant to bear. They take us places, they open doors where we're not meant to go spiritually, that aren't safe for us. I've often said a really bad trip is a psychological burden that I do not think the human psyche is meant to bear. Like I look back on the bad trips I had and I just thank God that he restored me from those. And in some cases it took quite a while because they were just really, really traumatizing. So I think in a sense, I was looking for God the whole time, but I also, and psychedelics were this weird, just such a fickle God, because on one hand, I felt like, and they give people the illusion that you have some modicum of control, even if it's just like, well, I control when I take this substance, like I am in a sense, and I've often said it was, with psychedelics, God was like a reality to be accessed. God was a state of consciousness that I could access at will. And sometimes it would turn really, really south. And then other times it felt like bliss. But it was stunning to me and humbling to me when I realized that, and I was so used to being so immersed in New Age religion and yoga philosophy and all these things that I could just kind of cherry pick what I wanted from these different religious traditions and these different ideas and incorporate them into whatever I would have deemed my religious practice or my religious beliefs. And so it was really stunning to me. And frankly, it was terrifying to realize that the claims that Jesus was making about who he was and about the supremacy he had and about the power he had and the claims he was making about who his father was, like just realizing, him saying, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. And no one comes to the Father except through me. And realizing and hearing sermons about, because we were starting to go to church, as I wrote about in my book, but it still took me a while, even after we had started going to church, to actually surrender. And I remember hearing, and I had grown up in a Methodist church. We weren't super duper involved in church, but I did have some foundation of hearing Christian language when I was growing up. But I still remember just sitting there in those church services and being like, what is he talking about? Like, I just don't understand this. I don't understand. And another problem was that, well, actually another thing though that drew me to Christ was that in the New Age world, in the yoga world, there was no concept of sin. There was no concept of, insofar as there might have been kind of an analogous concept, it was, our sin is forgetting that we're already whole and perfect, and we just have to do these, practices that will help us remember that we're already whole and perfect, and we are God, and we just have to remember that we are God. and reach enlightenment, through this variety of different practices. And so, but there was no concept of this like inherent sinfulness, inherent brokenness that we can't root out ourselves, that we can't fix ourselves. And I think when I got to that point of, and there were many things that happened, but one of the major things that happened was that one of my childhood friends, who had never abandoned her Christian faith, she had a 2-year-old who died very, very quickly of leukemia, like 3 weeks from diagnosis to her passing. And I think that really rattled me, just realizing that, because at that time my oldest son was right around that age, and I was newly pregnant with our daughter. And just realizing that this worldview that I had constructed was so shaky that I would have no ground to stand on if something like that happened to one of my children. I would have no hope. I would have there would be no hope of redemption, because in my view, it's like, you just, I don't even know that I could say I had like a really solid, well-developed view of what happens when we die. But insofar as I did, it would be something about like, we're just kind of all absorbed back into the ocean of consciousness, into this oceanic being, and our individual existence is obliterated. And I realized when I thought of Joella, the little girl who passed away, and I thought of my own children, like there was absolutely nothing comforting or hopeful or redemptive about that view. It was horrifying. And I think that was a major turning point for me. And also, so seeing like the inherent brokenness of the world, and also the inherent brokenness and sinfulness of myself. Like I started to realize I was not a good person. I was not a good person at all. I had been reckless and selfish with my drug use. There were a couple of times where my husband and I would, and it's, humiliating for me to admit this, and thank God that he protected my children. But my husband and I would take microdoses, which like I said, to me were half a hit or a quarter hit of acid, or, one little mushroom, when our children were in our care. And it just struck me. I remember it just struck me, like, how could I do that? Like, how could I be that selfish and disgusting? And so I think God was kind of lovingly assailing me from both directions of like, this inherently broken mess of a world around me, and also the inherently broken mess of myself. And I could not make sense of either of those things within the worldview that I had adopted. So I've often said what it was such a relief to come to Jesus Christ, because I had realized I could not save myself. And that's another, all of those new age modalities and psychedelics too, in a way, it's a practice of an attempt at self-salvation, at saving ourselves, at bringing about our own salvation through these different things. And I was to the point where it was not working. It hadn't worked for a long time. It never actually worked. It might have given an appearance of being promising that it was going to work in the beginning. And so I had gotten to a point where I realized, like, I cannot save myself. And if I cannot save myself, when all these, influences I listen to are telling me, well, that's what you have to do. Like, who is there? Who can, it just makes me think of the disciples saying, like, who, Lord, then can be saved, and Jesus said, with God, all things are possible. And I realized that Jesus was the only one who could save. He was the only one who could, his death and resurrection it was the only story that could offer, well, realizing it was a true story, but also it's the only story that can offer hope in the face of the enormity of human suffering and human brokenness. Like, I just realized this is the only, all these other philosophy, they just seemed like filthy rags. They just seemed like all of a sudden so inadequate. Like, how could I ever believe that any of these things could have possibly saved me or been adequate? And it just kind of hit me all at once. I remember I was out, it was a spring day, and my children and I were playing out on our front porch. And it was such a relief. It was such a profound, the most beautiful feeling of relief that I've ever experienced in my life. That, like, not only could I not save myself, I didn't have to, because Jesus was my savior, and he's a wonderful and beautiful savior. And, you know, another thing is I try to be honest in my book about that there were experiences on psychedelics that felt wonderful. They felt transcendent. They felt blissful. They felt even like I was in contact with something eternal. And I just wanted to be honest about that, you know, because obviously, like, and I thought it is fascinating. There were 2 different reviews that I got on Amazon, I think, and one gentleman said that he was worried that I made drug life sound too interesting. And then the other review was a very negative review, and he said he was a proponent of psychedelics, and he said that I made psychedelics sound horrible, and I did like the devil made me do it thing with acid, and like blaming acid for all my problems. So I was like, that's interesting that 2 people could read the same book and have such a different perspective. But the reason I tried to be honest about it was because I wanted to be honest about, like, how seductive these drugs can be. And nobody sins because it feels bad. Like, at first it feels good. It always feels good at first, but there's a trajectory involved that was going straight down. So
I think you did a great job in your book laying out the seductive nature and the trajectory of it, as you just said, because when you read, I didn't think you made psychedelics sound wonderful at all.
Okay, good.
I did think it sounded very scary, because the whole time, not the whole time, like in the beginning, you could tell like you were very enamored with them and like, you know, this is wonderful. But as the story went, the story of your life went, you could really tell that you were feeling very much like these things were a problem for you. And yet you couldn't escape them because you thought they were it, as you kept saying. And so I thought you, like, I messaged Cecily the other night and I was like, I kind of feel like I'm experiencing what it's like to be on drugs reading her writing, because you really explained what you were feeling, and it made it sound very scary, especially for somebody who doesn't want to open themselves up to any kind of spiritual damage, you know, that potentially could come. So I got a lot of messages when I started talking about, I never in my wildest dreams thought we'd be talking about psychedelics on the podcast. Like, this isn't where I thought we would go. And the amount of times I typed it into my search browser, like researching things to make a highlight to explain to my audience and things, like, I was like, this is never something I thought I'd be typing over and over. It's just very interesting to me. But anyways, in doing so, I got so many messages, really from a lot of people who had used LSD in the past and things. I feel very thankful that people feel like they can open up that in that way. But I was simultaneously a bit shocked how prevalent it was. But one of the messages I got was from somebody who's never used a drug. And I can see like her thoughts and a lot of Christians having these thoughts. So I just want to get your response to her question. She says, as someone who's never even tried marijuana, God can use many different paths for healing us. Doctors, procedures, protocols, pharmaceuticals, diet, lifestyle interventions. I don't discount that a natural part of the earth could be one more option. Secondly, in regards to being sober-minded, if psychedelics have healed people as they anecdotally claim it has, I believe they could be a means to a sober mind. Many people have terrible addictions, and even their unaltered sober mind is filled with chaos and lies as the result of trauma or imbalances in the brain. Could an experience like this actually serve to calm their mind and eliminate their self-soothing but dangerous addictions, thus creating the sober mind we are commanded to have. And so I can see a lot of Christians potentially going there, especially as the distrust for the pharmaceutical industry grows.
Right.
And we see that psychiatric pharmaceutical medications aren't always the answer. I do think there is a lot of trouble there, but that doesn't automatically mean that psychedelics are the answer.
Right.
And so I just want to hear, like, do you think if you hear somebody say, maybe God's using psychedelics as the way, like, what would you say to that?
You know, it's interesting that she brings up the natural thing, because that was toward the end of my psychedelic use. I remember thinking maybe the reason that it's not working anymore, that I couldn't have a good trip anymore is, and I had always preferred LSD. That had always been my preferred psychedelic. I took some others and mushrooms, took MDMA once, and salvia, mescaline, but LSD was always my favorite. But I got to a point where I thought, like, well, maybe the problem is that LSD is chemical. It's artificial. It was made in a laboratory. It was made by accident in a laboratory. But maybe that's the problem. Maybe I need to go back to Mother Earth. You know, maybe I need to go back to natural. And so I grew my own mushrooms. And I remember my husband and I took them, and things, you know, took about 20 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever. And the room started changing, things started changing, my perception started changing, and they came on really strong. And I was like, this was what I wanted, you know, but I just remember thinking, it's the same place. It's the exact same place as LSD. Like, this is not any different. It's the same. And so I just think the naturalistic thing, I think that's a fallacy. And it makes me think of, because creation itself is groaning. Like, I believe, I don't know what the doctrinal term for this would be, but I believe that since creation is groaning, like, creation is broken as well. And when Jesus returns and there's a new heaven and a new earth, it will be fully redeemed to what it should have, or what it was in the Garden of Eden. And I think about, in Miracles by C.S. Lewis, he talks about this a little bit, and talks about how, like, creation is almost her own creature, and she is not what she should be. She is not what she was originally designed to be. And so, with that in mind, I don't think nature is this perfect, pristine. I think it was in the Garden of Eden, but now I don't think it is this perfect, pristine thing that we can take anything we want from. And I lean natural with. So I'm about to have another baby, and I'm probably going to go back to natural birth, which is crazy. I kind of wish there was something that, I don't know, epidural didn't work for me, so I guess I'm doing natural again. But I do think, you know, I do lean natural in some of my thinking, but I just feel like that's a fallacy, you know, saying, like, well, it's natural, it's something God created, therefore it must be good for us. Because there are so many patent examples of things in nature that are not good for us, and in fact can kill us. And I think that's because all of creation is groaning, and it's not what it was supposed to be. And as far as, I just, like, when you said the thing about that you wrote about psychedelics giving us a sober mind, I think that's I think that's really off. Like, I don't think psychedelics provide any kind of clarity. I don't think they provide something that I think they do. And I guess this is just kind of a layman theory, but there was I think his name is Jim Wilder. He's written several books, and he calls himself a neurotheologian. And I got in touch with him several years ago, just because I had all these questions that were percolating in my mind about psychedelics, and, like, what really happened with all that? What was that? And he didn't have personal experience with psychedelics, but he knows a lot about neurology, obviously, and how things function in the brain. And he said that any drug that is, I think the term is serotonergic. So any drug that increases serotonin in the brain, which I'm pretty sure psychedelics will just dump serotonin into your brain. is going to increase our feelings of, like, serotonin is the meaning making chemical, And when I say things like this, like you all know, just because there's a material, physical reality to something doesn't mean there's also a spiritual reality. Like, I think they work in concert. But he said, when your brain is flooded with serotonin, everything around you is going to feel meaningful, regardless of whether it is authentically meaningful in a way that corresponds to something in reality. So when I was talking with Sam Tideman on, what's his podcast called, Transformed, he spoke really well about this too. He said, like, it's like psychedelics can give you the experience of profundity without a corresponding physical reality. So, like, there are participants in the Johns Hopkins studies who will say that their experience on there again, like I said, it's hard to discount someone's subjective experience, but once you kind of understand what's going on in your brain, like, people would rank their psychedelic experiences with the top 5 experiences of their life, including the birth of their child, the birth of their children. And, well, the birth of a child, there's an external reality. It's meant to be profound. Like, God designed it that way. It's meant to be meaningful. And I'm sure it releases, well, I know it does release certain chemicals in our brains as women. And I'm sure for, our husbands, for the father, like, even people in the room, like, I remember my best friend from high school and college was there at the birth of our daughter. And she said it was just a profoundly meaningful experience for her. And so, but like I said, that's because God designed it that way. It's supposed to be meaningful. But then you can take this drug and all of a sudden, like, I remember when being on acid and walking down the street, and we would see, I always use this example just because it's funny, but my husband and I, we would see, like, a single glove. We lived in Kansas City, in the middle of the city. We just always see these things like a single glove or a single sock or a single shoe in the road, and just build this whole framework of meaning around it, and, like, what that meant that was there, and how it corresponded to things that had happened earlier in the evening, and how it corresponded to our lives, and what it meant for the future, and now I'm like, it was just a sock. Like, it doesn't, so, and that's where psychedelics can get extremely dangerous too, because you have people like Charlie Manson loved acid, and Mel Lyman, and these cult leaders. And I've heard plenty of stories now too of these self-styled cult leaders, and a lot in South America around ayahuasca, but also in the US of people who I've heard of, people thinking they are the second coming of Jesus Christ. I mean, Charlie Manson believed that he was God, of course, in a really scary way. But if you have a thought like that while you're on psychedelics, like, it can seem like mind blowing, like, wow, that is true. It can make things seem true that are not true. And, and especially when you, like, think about that among, like, diverse people, diverse subjective experiences, like, I mean, hundreds of thoughts pass through our heads every day, and it doesn't mean that they're all true. But if you're on psychedelics and you have some bizarre thought pass through your head, like, it can seem profoundly true, even if it's not. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where it can get really dangerous. So as far as it engendering a sober mind, I would caution with that. And also, like we were talking about earlier, with the extremely destabilizing sweeping the house clean experience, like, well, what's there then? And what have you opened the door to and created a space for to come in? Mm-hmm. And that's where I absolutely think that psychedelics do open people up to spiritual dimensions. And that's a place where it can get really dangerous. I mean, I've read so many stories about people encountering demons on psychedelics. It's just really scary. And they don't always appear as demons, obviously, but entities and even Joe Rogan talks about encountering entities, on DMT. And it's like, how do you know that these entities are looking out for your good? And oftentimes, obviously, they're not. They say things, or they do things. And yeah, it's a super scary realm. And that's interesting to me. You said the person who wrote that has never actually taken psychedelics, but
not even tried marijuana or any kind of drug.
Interesting.
Just was like, what if God's using it for good type of thing? And I can see a lot of Christians saying that, especially in the realm of, like we talked about, natural medicine and, looking to natural forms versus pharmaceuticals. So I don't know. I
appreciate the optimism, but I think it's very misguided. I guess that would be my short answer.
Helpful. So,
yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, Cecily, do you have anything else?
No, not really. Okay. I'm just like, to go with that conversation, to tag on to it, is just, I think another reason a Christian who hasn't ever tried any sort of drug might also feel that way is just because of the people that are saying it, right? Right. We talk a lot on the podcast about teams. It's like, well, these people are on our team and these people are not on our team. And so over the past couple of years, people like Joe Rogan, they seem more aligned to the right. And so people want to believe that what they're saying, because they've agreed on certain points, they want to believe that everything they're saying might be good, which is not necessarily the case, which is why I think just a super important part of this conversation going forward, like if psychedelics is still at the top of RFK's list, then people need to be willing to like really think critically about it, listen to people like you, and be willing to diverge from your team if you think your team might be making a wrong decision. So,
right.
Cecily,
and it is. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you. It is fascinating how, like, because you would think of psychedelics like 60s hippies, like leftist people mostly, but it really has infiltrated conservative circles. Yeah. And it's just a lot. Rick Perry, I guess, is like a huge advocate for psychedelics now, the former governor of Texas. And it is startling to see. And that's really sound advice, like you said. And it grieves me a little because I do see, people who are naive about psychedelics. If they see someone like RFK, whom they trust on other things, or even JD Vance, whom they trust on other things, saying that these things are good and these things are healing. It's concerning.
Yeah. I'm so glad you brought that up, Cecily, because that is a point I really wanted to address. And I'm going to read just part of a message that absolutely just says exactly what you're saying. She said, Kennedy must have some knowledge about this use, so I'm keeping an open mind. We only know the misuse. And I got several messages along those lines, like, well, I trust Kennedy, so it's okay. And that's one thing regardless of what the topic is, you need to be paying attention. You can't just like put everything in the hands of someone because you've trusted them on most things. Right. We have to use our brains and kind of evaluate things based on our worldview and our values, which is the point of this podcast. It's like evaluating things based on our foundational values. So anyway,
I always had a little more, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No,
I guess I think RFK is good. I always had a little more like, because I know he's pro-abortion. And so I've always been a little more like, not sure about this guy. And then, but yeah, it is worrying. So hopefully people will be discerning and yeah.
I don't want people to hear him like, bragging on RFK right now or anything. Cause I really really like him. That's what brought this to light in conversation. And that's what people are kind of latching onto. So it's very relevant to bring up. And I don't know, I appreciate this conversation so much because it is very culturally relevant, whether people know it or not. And there's a lot for people to be concerned about and pay attention to going forward. And I can't speak to it like the way you can. And you can really speak with experience and help people understand the dangers and the beauty of finding Jesus after all of it. So very, very much appreciate the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Oh, and I do have your book here, so I'll hold it up for people.
Thank you.
It was very good, you guys. And like I said earlier, even separate the psychedelic portion. A lot of us who are in the natural wellness realm, like trying to do things more naturally, there's a lot for everyone to evaluate. So
do you have anywhere that you want to direct people? Obviously, we recommend that people go get your book. Is there anything else that you would point people to for what you do and those sorts of things?
I have a very neglected website that's just ashleylande.com. Gosh, and I should have already listed, like, as far as other resources about psychedelics from a Christian worldview. You know, there are so many. Well, one book I would recommend is called God's Forever Family, which is a history of the Jesus People movement in the 60s and 70s. And the whole book isn't about psychedelic hippies coming to Christ, but the first couple chapters have a lot of really great stories and testimonies of people from that era coming to Christ out of psychedelic use. So, yeah, that's the only thing I can think of off the very top of my head. But I feel like in the years to come, Christians will be probably forced to come up with more concrete thinking on this. And you know, I think it kind of makes me sad that a lot of those people from the one person that was really prominent in God's Forever Family, Ted Wise, is no longer alive. And I just think like, oh man, I wish he were still alive, because he would be such a great resource. But it's unfortunate. A lot of those voices are kind of fading out. But I think in the years to come that the church will need to respond to this and need to develop like a more robust way of thinking about it and interacting with it.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
We really appreciate you coming on. It was great to meet you. Great to hear your story. And yeah, we just wish you much success in the future as you continue doing the work that you're doing.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Such an interesting conversation we just had with Ashley. And this is why, one of the reasons I love having the podcast, because we get to have conversations that we maybe would not have had before doing the podcast. And I think that's a true blessing. And I hope for you guys as listeners listening to these conversations that you feel the same way. So please go ahead and leave us a review wherever you're listening. Podcast. Whoa, not podcast. I was going to say Spotify. The brain sometimes, right? Spotify, Apple, YouTube, subscribe and follow. We would super appreciate it. And every time you share an episode or leave us a review, it really does help us. So thank you for that. And if you want to find us outside the podcast, you can find us on Instagram at Boom Clap Podcast, or you can find us individually. I'm on Instagram at cecily.dickey, or my website, thegracetogrow.com.
And you can find me, Rita, at ritarogersco.com or Rita Rogers Co on Instagram. Thanks for listening.